economics, of course, is about the allocation of scarce resources. We have limited resources and we have to figure out how we allocate them. Thinking back to these two images, if you were the mayor of the city, you had to decide if you had to spend your last tax dollar on a new road to facilitate transportation and facilitate financial activity, or if you have to spend your last dollar on buying a healthcare facility. You would have to think about the cost and benefit, the economic cost and benefit of both of those two things. And environmental economics is really trying to make sure that we maximize the well-being of humans. We are trying to minimize that cost on human life. Now, a big thing that is implied in all of these things we're talking about is the idea of externality. And externality is asking the question, who bears the cost? When you get in your car, you are bearing some cost for the maintenance of the car in terms of the gasoline. But you're not bearing the cost of the grandma 1 kilometer down the road who has to spend an extra 3 days in ICU because your pollution is aggravating her lungs. This additional cost which you're not bearing from your activity is called an externality. It's a negative externality. And negative externalities are things such as, and I just want to keep on returning to this example with COVID, we're seeing in cities such as Vancouver, you're seeing more killer whales and other types of whales. In India, you're seeing monkeys kind of stray into the city. In Colorado, you're seeing mountain lions. Now, things such as lamps, machinery that produce noise, these are producing positive economic benefits for us, but they're also causing negative externalities because they're negatively impacting the wildlife. So environmental economics is trying to answer the question, who should bear the cost of these negative externalities? Who should bear the cost of grandma's health being negatively impacted? And this is where we look at things such as cost-benefit analysis of different policies. We look at things such as environmental taxes. Should you have to pay an extra tax for using your car? And this is also where we do policy evaluation, such as saying, okay, a city like Milan will have 2 days with no cars per week, right? Let's evaluate the impact of that policy, not just on the economy, but on human well-being, right? And this is the core idea of environmental economics. Of course, an idea that you guys and some people asked about this must be very familiar with is the idea of valuation and valuing the environment. And I want to ask you all, why do you think this beautiful green iguana is valuable? I think Omar has a poll that he'll put up for you guys right now to answer. And I want you guys to select one answer from this. And I think once you all vote, we'll get the results. I'm just going to wait on the results. Has everyone voted? Please just quickly vote so we can get the results. Now, I'm assuming if we asked most of the Trinidadian public, why is this valuable? Many of them would choose, answer 1. Maybe some would choose 2. I'm going to assume, and I don't want to bias the results, that this group is not going to be representative. You guys are already interested in the environment and are a biased sample of the population. Omar, can you close the poll so we can get the results? Yeah, so, as I predicted, most of you all are saying because it exists, and none of you all said because I can eat it or sell it. So we have a bit of a biased group here, not necessarily representative of the Trinidadian population. But the answer I wanted, or what I wanted to illustrate here, is that every single answer is actually valid. And every single answer is a different component of total economic value. So for a specific species, for a specific ecosystem, we have something called total economic value, which sums up all of the ways in which it contributes to human well-being, and sometimes can be converted into a dollar figure. So the first answer, because I can eat it or sell it, is called direct use value. It's when we're directly using the ecosystem. In this case, we would eat or sell the iguana. In the case of a forest, we would potentially get water from that ecosystem and use that water, right? Now, the next one, because it's good for tourism, is indirect use value. You're not actually capturing that iguana, but you're using it indirectly and benefiting from it in terms of some sort of income if you're a tour guide operator or some other operator in the tourism industry. Now, because it may have a miracle corona cure, I mean, this is also totally possible. We don't know right now because we're not actively experimenting on the biogenetics of iguanas, but this is also totally possible. Many ecosystems have a value in the future or a potential value, and this in environmental economics is called the option value. Of course, some people, most of you all show it because it exists. This is called existence value, and this is actually one of the most difficult things to put into dollars and figures. But for many of us, particularly environmentalists, it is arguably one of the most important. Of course, we also have the inheritance value, which is called the Hest value, or the value of being able to pass that thing on to the next generation. You know, the idea that your children may grow up never have seen a live iguana ever is kind of, you know, terrifying. So I think that is the final component of total economic value. And the idea here is that each of these things are important. And for a mangrove ecosystem, it provides wood, it provides medicine, it can be used for tourism, it may provide medicine, it may be enjoyed by my children, and it's good because it simply exists. Each of these building blocks go into the entire house of total economic value, and when we're doing valuation, we're trying to examine and ascertain these things. So this is just a nutshell what environmental economics does. There's another field called ecological economics, which I'll speak to at the very end, which is also very important, but it kind of is more expansive and places the environment at even higher level of importance than environmental economics. So let's talk briefly about environmental diplomacy. Well, the idea here is that, you know, our borders are artificial, social, political, geographic, administrative. They're not real. You know, in space, when you look, all of these things are connected. Our atmosphere has no borders. And if you were an international space station staring down, you could not see the difference between Guyana, Venezuela, the Orinoco, and Trinidad. It's just all really one thing together. And that's also how our environment operates. In Guyana, a leaf is falling into a river, which is going to decompose into nutrients, which is eventually going to be flushed into the Gulf of Paria, consumed by a shrimp, which is then consumed by a snapper, which could migrate all the way to Antigua, be harvested, and put on the plate of, you know, Richard Branson. This is essentially to say that all of our ecologies are connected, and poor management in Guyana can affect Antigua and vice versa. So, you know, me operating independently and reducing my climate change emissions, me acting independently and trying to capture all of the lionfish in my country's borders, if my neighbor is not also reducing their emissions, if my neighbor is not also capturing all of the lionfish will just stray. The environmental pollution still goes into the atmosphere. So without collective action, we really and truly, to use a Caribbean phrase, we're jammed. We're in a big problem. So I think environmental diplomacy is critical right now because we need people who can bridge this science policy divide, but also get countries to cooperate together. Now, to speak about the science policy divide, this is the idea that neither party wants to understand the other. The scientist thinks that the politician is squandering all of our resources and doesn't care at all about our long-term well-being, whereas a politician thinks as a scientist is totally impractical and unaware of the groupthink of a nation, how crowds react to certain policies. And the fact of the matter is both of their truths or both of their realities are true. So I think in environmental diplomacy, you can approach it from two different directions. And if you are an early stage professional, you can think, you know, could I be a diplomat who understands basic science better and can explain that to other diplomats even better? Or could I be the scientist who understands the realities of politics, the realities of groupthink, and maybe then propose a policy which may not be the academic ideal, but may balance academic ideal with political possibility and expediency. So I think environmental diplomacy is really about bridging that science policy divide, but also getting countries to cooperate together, which can be very difficult because it requires individual sacrifice for collective benefit. Of course, as I said, it's essential for meaningful change. So let's look forward. And I want to do a little bit of behavioral economics here. I want to ask you guys a question. Let's imagine when you were born, you are connected to a machine that produces, there's a typo here, produces a consciousness of the perfect life for you. It knows you inside out, and it says, I'm going to produce the stimuli that is a perfect life. So right now, this life that you've lived so far was produced by the machine, right? But one day someone knocks on your door and says, ma'am, sir, you were connected to the wrong machine at birth. This life that you were living, which has been very difficult, but is really the perfect edition of your life where you have to go through difficulty to enjoy things later on, it was the wrong one. We can connect you to the new machine, or the right machine, sorry, not the new machine. We can connect you to the right machine. You ready to say your goodbyes and connect to the right machine? Or do you want to stay in this machine, which is a wrong one, but you can stay in it? So Omar, could you put the poll up? Would you stay in your current body/machine, or would you switch? So guys, please answer the poll question. If you're across the room and listening to it, run back across to your computer and click yes or no. Would you switch machines to the one perfectly designed for you, or stick to the one that you've been living in thus far? All right, still waiting on the answers. Okay, well, did most of you all answer, I would switch machines? And you all, I mean, hold on, let me just look at the participants. We have 15 participants. And if you guys could just put up your hand, and most of you all choose, I would switch machines. All right, so we have some machine switchers, right? So actually, only 3 of you all said that you would switch machines, maybe 4, right? So maybe I didn't answer the, maybe I didn't ask the question properly, but it says 3 of you all said you would switch machines, right? So less people would switch machines, and most people would stay with their current machine based on the hands, right? Based on the poll, actually the opposite, but I wanted to maybe check with the hands, right? Now, again, you guys are a biased sample. I think a lot of you all are scientists, but the fact of the matter is most people, hold on, can you all see these results? Oh, let me change this, I didn't switch, right? Oh, shucks, some people are asking questions. Will I get to keep all of my memories? No, you lose all of your memories. So I feel like most people would stay, right? And when you do this experiment with the general population, most people stay with their current machine, right? Some of you all switched, but let's say that you all are the exception to the rule, right? And the general thing that we're trying to show here is the idea of the status quo bias, right? And the status quo bias is why we have quote unquote conservative behavior. As creatures, as animals, we're actually wired to want to stick to the familiar. We are wired to want to stick to what we know. You know, when we were cave people, you know, you probably saw a very juicy plump fruit. Sorry, you've been eating a nice regular fruit all day, and then right beside it, you saw a fruit with a slightly different shade, but plumper, juicier looking, you know? All of your things are telling you, that one looks better, you know? That one is probably better. More than likely it's better based on all my experience. But your caveman brain is telling you, listen, choose the familiar. Because you know that Larry, caveman Larry, chose another random fruit which he's never tried before, and he died, right? So the general idea is that as human beings, as creatures, we generally like to stick to the status quo. We like to stick to the familiar, right? And this is because of a couple of other things called cognitive biases, right? Or shortcuts that we make in our reasoning to be able to survive or evolve to this point. One of them is called loss aversion, where we prefer to keep things rather than lose things. We have the sunk cost fallacy, where once we've kind of got used to doing things a certain way, we don't want to expend the cost to switch. And then we have mere exposure effect. I've been exposed to this. This is what I know. I don't want to try anything different, right? I don't want to try crispy doubles. I've been eating regular doubles my entire life. Crispy doubles may be nicer. When these crispy doubles may be nicer, but you stick to what you're used to, right? Now, with the COVID-19 situation, there's been a sudden shift in the status quo, right? Oil is at zero. We are forced to consume only what is considered essential, and work from home is suddenly normal. If last year you told people, line up to go to the supermarket, if you told companies 80% of the employees have to work from home, most of them would say, never, I'll never do that. If you tell people, listen, we are going to say that you can drive your car 50% less, say that to Trinidadians, people would say, you'll never get that policy through. Trinidadians are going to riot, right? That's because people stick to what they're used to. Now, with this big situation, there's a huge opportunity for us because there's been a shift in our status quo to change current activities. You're consuming less, so it's actually the best time to tell people, guess what? We're going to reduce the number of goods available to you. You're driving less. In Milan, they've actually decided to institute a policy reducing car use by 70% in downtown Milan because of COVID-19. They've been trying to implement this policy for years, but because people have been forced to shift, they're more willing to accept this new status quo. So right now we have major opportunities to revamp our economy, and we have to ask ourselves in this COVID time, what changes in behavior were good, but people would resist before, that they're willing to accept now that the situation has changed. Now, I'm beginning to go over time. We can talk a bit more about COVID afterwards. So I just want to get to the last bit of my presentation. I want to give you guys, early stage professionals, a bit of career advice because that's also how this webinar was pitched. So I know this may not appeal to the entire audience, but I think it's important to the early stage professionals out there. I want to say that you have to combine your passion with a practical and cross-employable skill. Don't just do environment because you're passionate about the environment. Combine environment with something else which you think is cross-employable, not just in your dream NGO job. Because to be honest, there are only so many dream NGO jobs out there, and you have to get a little bit of experience until you're able to even access them. So it may be good to have some geographic information systems experience, which is cross-transferable. GIS is used in telecommunications. GIS is used in energy. GIS is used by WASA. You know, the police use GIS. So I think having practical cross-employable skills is very, very, very important. And you must make sure that in your degree and in studying, you have some of those, because the environment field is a very fickle one and there are very few dream and NGO jobs out there. I think as well, you have to differentiate yourself. And in economics, we talk about the concept of comparative advantage. What is the one thing that I do better than most people? And how am I different from most people who have environment degrees? And the easiest way to do this is to combine your core knowledge, whether it be environment or economics, with some other skill. So a lot of people combine environment with their ability to communicate. If you have good videography skills, you can maybe become an environmental documentarian. So you want to say when you're applying for a job, I don't just have skills in ecology, I have skills in ecology and project management. I have skills in ecology and video editing. I have skills in ecology and statistics. You want to differentiate yourself by combining what you have with something a bit different, which is my experience with environmental economics, and this is kind of how I ended up here. Finally, I think when you're choosing degrees, but particularly courses, train in what you can't teach yourself. and teach yourself everything else. If you're paying someone to teach you, make sure it's something that you can't teach yourself on the internet. You know, I love politics, I love political science. Do I think I could have gotten a job with a political science degree or political science courses? No. So what do? In my personal time, I try to read as much literature and material on political science as possible, because I know that's an important skill, but I'd rather pay or train in something that I cannot teach myself. So those are some career tips. And I just wanted to highlight, in environmental economics, there's so many subfields. There's agricultural economics, which of course deals with, you know, agriculture. You have natural resource economics, which is dealing with resource extraction. How often should we take water out of the river? How often should we cut down timber from the forest if we're replanting timber? How often should we replant timber if we want to cut down trees in 20 years' time, right? So that's natural resource economics. Of course, we have behavioral economics, which is, why do we do what we do? You know, that experiment I did with all of the cognitive biases, it's really drilling down. That's a big part, sorry, of environmental economics, and trying to understand why we're illogical. There's economics of renewable energy, economics of green infrastructure, and of course, ecological economics, which is the cousin relative of environmental economics, but it's arguably more important. Environmental economics pushes what is called soft sustainability, because in environmental economics, I don't want to say we, I'm across fields. It's believed that you can replace some parts of the environment with capital. You know, if your forest is purifying water, you can maybe replace it with a water purification plant. It may be more expensive to put the plant there, but it's possible. Ecological economics basically says that the environment could never be substituted and could never be replaced. And it begins to really examine how we can live in total and complete harmony with our ecology. So that's a brief introduction to environmental economics and environmental diplomacy, and looking into the future. I hope I stimulated you guys a bit, and I'm sure you have many questions, particularly about COVID, and I'm looking forward to hearing them from you. So thank you so very much for listening to me today.
Okay, thanks so much, Alex. All right, so I'm not seeing any Q&As in the Q&A option yet, but if you all have any questions and comments now, please use the raise hand option, and I will unmute you to start the conversation. And maybe, well, while people think about their questions, maybe I can ask one. Where in the region do you think, in the Caribbean, what are some good examples of more integrative economic models that have included some level of environmental or ecological economics?
In the region, I think people always will refer to Costa Rica, because Costa Rica has something or many payment for environmental services or payment for ecosystem services schemes, where they're paying farmers on the hillside to do more sustainable practices to reduce the degradation of water quality downstream. So Costa Rica has a lot of experience in that regard. Mexico also is quite forward thinking and very good at integrating information on the environment in everyday decisions, kind of making it more technocratic and less political. So I think those are the two. Right now, I recommend to everyone, and Omar, we discussed this briefly, the donut model that Amsterdam is about to implement, placing bounds almost on the economy, understanding that economy cannot be, you know, totally unbounded. You cannot have unlimited consumption forever. I think that's also an interesting example that people can look at.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm gonna, Daryl, would you like to ask your question? I've just unmuted you, so feel free.
All right, thanks, Omar. I was just wondering, when could we expect to have a functioning carbon tax or cap and trade system in the region, or some sort of partnership with Latin America?
I think when can we expect? I think that really depends on political will and how willing our political bodies are to integrate that. But I think there are a couple of interesting things to think about when it comes to mitigation in the region. We would first, to be able to implement any cap on trade, have to fully document who is emitting and how much. Because the idea with cap and trade is that emissions are up here, but collective emissions are up here, but you reduce it a bit collectively and make sure that everyone is individually reducing their consumption a bit, or if they're not reducing the consumption, they're purchasing the ability to consume from other people, right? So that's the general idea with cap and trade. You cap it below where it is currently, and then people can trade internally. So it would we would have to be documenting in a more detailed manner who is emitting, how much they're emitting, how much we project them to emit in the future. I think what's also potentially important, you're speaking about climate change and mitigation. I love to stress that in the Caribbean, mitigation is very important from a moral standpoint, so that we can go to Paris and argue in Paris, listen, we are also reducing our consumption. Please, big countries, reduce your consumption. But realistically, in our region, faced with climate change impacts right now, adaptation is arguably more important. We have to figure out how to adapt to rainfall, which has already changed in Trinidad and Tobago, where I reside. Rainfall patterns have changed significantly. So we have to think about how is the water authority going to adapt to reduce water supply? How are they going to adapt to increased erosion in their water treatment plants? We have to begin to think about how our societies and economies are going to adapt, I think, because the impacts are happening now, and put that as high importance with mitigation. Mitigation feels good, gives us more moral authority, but for our survival, adaptation is essential.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. We have a raised hand from Zico. You can go ahead and unmute and ask or give your comment.
It's actually Marshall for Newsday. I'm wondering, for an island like Trinidad and Tobago that's so heavily dependent on the oil and gas industry, how do you see us reducing our carbon footprint while still not derailing the economic strength of the island going forward from here?
Well, I mean, I think the big thing for Trinidad and Tobago is, most of us, or many of us, know that Trinidad and Tobago exports mainly gas, right? Trinidad does produce a little bit of oil, but the oil is more important for the downstream industries. And I'm speaking here acknowledging that I'm not an energy economist first and foremost, so there's some things I may not get fully right? But the oil is more important and the gas is more important in terms of Trinidad's comparative advantage for downstream, so production of methanol, production of other chemicals, because the oil and natural gas are inputs into that, right? But they also reduce energy costs for those big plants. So it's cheap and they have easily accessible inputs, right? In terms of moving forward and reducing kind of carbon emissions in Trinidad, I think you have to look at the major sectors. I think transportation is a major sector as well, not just industrial ones. And maybe think about how you're reducing emissions there. I think, and this is kind of just framing your specific question. Marshall, could you ask me could you just mention the question one more time? Because I think I just framed it, but there was a specific thing I wanted to answer.
Oh yeah, no problem. Just to figure out how we can go about reducing emission in general. I'm happy you touched on transportation, because I can imagine how much that has reduced things drastically since nobody is really going anywhere. But apart from that, because I imagine, well, we know gas prices have gone all the way down. So I'm just wondering how, what would be feasible options for us to explore as a region that won't have some kind of negative impact to this extent on the on the planet?
Right. Well, I think, all right, so renewables are, of course, an obvious option for a place like Trinidad. And I think, having all of those capacities in oil and gas, engineering capacities, science capacities, there is a possibility of Trinidad and Tobago pivoting to improve its ability to, A, produce renewable energy domestically, but also to produce solutions for the other islands. I think if you take some of those engineering capacities from the petrochemical industry, can you assemble photovoltaic panels here? Can Trinidad and Tobago assemble what they call micro hydro plants, which allow people, in a pyramid with one river to produce enough electricity for just the community there, kind of decentralized grid. So I think Trinidad and Tobago does have a risk because you're so heavily embedded in petrochemicals. But the fact of the matter is the export of the downstream things, that's not going to stop. For your domestic production, though, because you have all of these resources, not just people, not just capital, you could be investing in renewable energy right now to drive your domestic production of CO2 down, but also the domestic cost of energy down in the long run, because you already have those pool of expertise. So I think Trinidad has an opportunity. It just needs to realize that a shift in the status quo could be for its benefit. And if it itself is going renewable, that doesn't mean the buyers of its energy and downstream products are suddenly going to disappear. If you understand what I'm saying. You can sell something that you yourself don't consume.
Yeah, sweet. All right, thanks. Great response. Thanks, man.
Great. Okay, Alex, we have a raised hand from Della. Della, you can feel free to give your comment or you ask your question now.
Hi, are you hearing me?
Yes,
yes, Stella.
Okay. So we've gone from one extreme to the next, and it's showing up in the environment. For example, that Milan picture that you put up, we've seen, video where the giraffes are coming into what would normally be human-occupied areas. So in going forward, us as the environmental managers and scientists, how do we make that input into what is going to be the new realm in terms of bouncing forward and having a more resilient and more sustainable environment now, where we don't, as humans, have such a big impact on the environment that we've been having in the past, hence climate change and all the anthropogenic effects.
Well, I mean, I think you're asking from a perspective of an environmentalist or somebody in the field. I think right now documenting the benefit is essential. I think we basically have a big experiment where these animals are coming in, where the air is cleaner, where the water is cleaner. Document benefits to people, particularly health benefits to people, but also document maybe some of what the negative impacts are. Because if you are arguing to an authority, hey, we need to allow giraffes to roam into our city. And then the authorities say, no, we can't allow that. It's going to, disrupt garbage. It's going to cause, disrupt the traffic, disrupt the lines, etc. Right now what you can do is you can be documenting these changes that are happening, documenting the benefits to people, documenting the impacts so that when things are going back to normal, you can say, listen, I observe these things that have changed, let's make them permanent because they came with these benefits. And I think, this is why I wanted to speak about the status quo bias, because it's the best possible time to say to people, hey, you tested it and it's not that bad, and I think the biggest picture right now is the whole idea of conspicuous and constant consumption, I think it was Einstein who said that, once a mind has been expanded, it's impossible to return it to its original dimensions, right? And the same thing goes to a certain extent with consumption. Once I'm used to consuming this variety and volume of products, telling me that I'm consuming less is basically like telling me you're putting me in communist China, right? So I think now that people have experienced slightly less, you can say, hey, listen, you've experienced less. That other alternative where there's plenty is great. But this time when you experience less, these are all the benefits it's generated. So can you stick to having less because you have cleaner air and it's killing, less people every year, which is what is happening right now. Huh? The cleaner air may actually reduce deaths by more than the increase in COVID deaths, which is insane. That's how every year, dirty air is killing hundreds of thousands of people, but we kind of say, well, we kind of have to accept it. So I think as environmentalists right now, document the benefits so that when things are going back to normal, you can argue for a shift in the status quo to this shift that has currently happened. I hope that answers your question.
It does.
And if I could just add one other thing, I think it's also important for environmentalists especially to not get carried away with the idea of sort of over-preaching the benefits of the environmental benefits of something like the pandemic, because it should not be an either-or situation. We should not have to be locked up in our houses and people dying for us to have a healthy environment. I think the idea also is important to, when all of these countries, including Trinidad and Tobago, I will encourage you all to look up the Prime Minister's 14-page outline of the recovery roadmap plan, where they're asking very important questions about the economy and what the economy is meant to do. Not just what it is, but what it's meant to do. It's important, as Alex said, to really look and pay attention to these issues of consumption and production, because we have this obsession with growth and a growing economy, and we all need to grow our economies, and a bigger economy is better. But that's contingent on these two things of production and consumption. So, the idea is that we don't need to consume so much. And if we don't need to consume so much, we don't need to produce as much. So therefore, your overall impact on the environment is lessened, but you still are able to deliver all of the items that you need for human well-being. So it's now a good time to really sort of pay attention to what are the underlying ideologies that make up what we call an economy. So, it will be interesting as environmentalists and environmental economists, etc., to really look and see how do these things inform our narrative moving forward. But before you answer this other question, Alex, there's one from Ariane Marie. If I could just, where is she? Ariane, you can ask your question now. You can unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Okay,
so I asked earlier this year, BP proposed that they want to reduce their emissions and they want to move towards carbon zero and more towards renewable energy. And I wanted to know how you think that would affect the economy of Trinidad and just in general how BP performs on their functions.
You cut out there on how BP what? I missed that last part.
How BP performs and how their functions would have to change to reach the carbon zero.
You cut out there?
Well, I could actually answer. I know a little bit about it. I think it's very important for us to pay close attention to intent and reality. Most of the oil majors, as they call them, have, they're leading the world in terms of investment into renewables. But there is a report by Carbon Tracker Initiative that has done a full economic model of all of the capital investment by the oil majors, and every single one has, within the last 2 years, made serious capital investments in infrastructure projects that depend on countries not meeting their Paris Agreement. So what that means is that they could only get a return on investment on their capital expenditures if we do not meet 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, which means that oil and gas remains at a high price and not at the low prices that would ensure we meet those 1.5 and 2 degrees. So it is important, I think, Ariane, to look and see what their stated conditions are. But I think like any other multinational, their actions will be driven by where the profit is. And if the profit remains in fossil energy, then slowly but surely the operations will adjust to suit. So it's important for governments voted in by citizens to ensure that those energy transitions happen, because that's the only way they're going to actually change their activities, to be very honest.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Alex, I think we just have about 1 or 2 minutes left. So we have a question from Alyssa about what good environmental economic books do we recommend. We also have, can you get a degree in environmental diplomacy? Quickly with economic books, I will give my 2 maybe. One is Donut Economics by Kate Rayworth, which is a must read. So it's Donut Economics, ways to think like a 21st century economist. It should be #1 on your list. It looks at it shows how to position the economy between social well-being and environmental planetary boundaries. And the second one would be The Future We Want by the former head of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Christiana Figueres. Those 2 are mine. Alex, what are your 2?
So I'm going to give you, as you expect, a roundabout answer. I think if it's really about environmental economics, I think the field has changed a little bit in the last 15 years. And I think every 5 years, new concepts are coming up. I think if you want a good introduction, I would start with the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, called TEEB. It's a global initiative, and they have their information in very well structured, but also summarized for policymakers and summarized for non-economists. So for general stuff, not a book, I would start there. If you're thinking of a very big picture, how did we get here? I would actually recommend a documentary called The Century of Self. And The Century of Self really begins to understand where the idea of mass consumption came from. It's actually about this guy called Edward Bernays, I think his name is. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew in the States, and he was the one who created modern-day marketing. And modern-day marketing combined with post-World War II America is what resulted in the whole idea that we must consume. Consumption is part of our identity. And that is actually what resulted in our modern economy, which creates all of these environmental problems. So I would say that those 2 pieces of material are probably the best. I'll think about a single book which captures it, and I can't really think of one off the top of my head, but if not, I'll send to Omar and we can email to the participants.
Yeah.
To answer the question about a degree in environmental diplomacy, right now, no, you cannot. I feel like some people may offer degrees along those lines, but people generally, I don't think so. And I would actually go as far as to recommend that you do not do something like that. My degree in environmental economics came afterwards. I did a double major in geography and economics. And then I afterwards went on to do a specialist environmental economics degree. This is what I was trying to capture in my career advice. Combine 2 things and learn things that you cannot teach yourself. With the environmental diplomacy, I would actually, as I said, start from either angle. Start in regular diplomacy and then differentiate yourself with an environmental knowledge, or start with as an environmentalist, but begin to appreciate, learn, read about diplomacy, interact with other diplomats, see opportunities where you can advise them. And there are many, because even Trinidad is party to many multilateral environmental agreements, and there are specific departments in the Ministry of Planning, but also in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which are meant to deal with these things. So you have a lot of diplomats in Trinidad, a lot dealing with environmental issues, and you have a lot of environmental scientists representing the government in diplomatic forums. So I think the idea here is approach from one or two angles, but make sure your grounding is solid in one of the two. And I wouldn't start at the level of an environmental diplomacy degree. It's too specialized at the early stage. But that's just me personally.
Okay,
Any
so
last questions?
We'll wrap up with our last one from Colleen, who I believe is listening in from Aruba. So I will unmute her, and Colleen has the last question of the session.
Hello, hearing me well?
Yes.
Right, so I typed my question, but here it is. Do you think that cost-benefit analyses are the best way of determining whether a specific policy or development project should be pursued by a government? And if not, what other approaches can be taken? That's it.
Okay. So I'm going to answer you and say, I'm assuming that, when you mention cost-benefit analysis with environmental projects, they have environmental cost-benefit analysis, which is just, a jargon term. So I'm assuming you're talking about that. Is it the best way? It really depends on how well it's done. And any good person doing a cost-benefit analysis will initially acknowledge its limitations. So I would actually say that it depends on the political climate. I think it's a great tool. Is it the best tool? No. And it really depends on what kind of policy you're evaluating. Because with some things, as I said earlier, such as existence value, just the value of something existing, putting a dollar figure on it is almost impossible. So that information is not going to be captured in a cost benefit. And because it's not captured, your whole analysis may be a little bit you cannot expect your analysis to be able to help you perfectly allocate or allocate those resources well. There's a big chance that it may be a little bit off. So the short answer is, I think it's one of the better tools. Is it the best? Definitely not. And everything should be qualified with, to be honest, just humanness. Just an awareness that, we are human, we don't fully understand things, there's a lot of uncertainty, etc., etc. But as well, actually, and from a technical standpoint, the precautionary principle. And I think I advise everyone to look up the precautionary principle. It's generally that if you're not sure, you should err on the side of caution. And I think that always applies. Even when you're using cost-benefit analysis, which is meant to give you a more precise answer, the precautionary principle always applies. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you all very much. I really hope that was informative. And I understand that some of you all will be joining our subsequent webinars. So yes, so thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alexander, for joining us. And everyone have a great day. And I'll see some of you all soon. Take care, everyone.